It was the first to broadcast radio waves from space. It was the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. It reformed science education in the US. It accelerated space programs and led to the founding of NASA. It was Sputnik. On October 4, 1957, news poured in that the Soviet Union had successfully launched the first artificial satellite into space. This launch instigated a national panic that would be known as the Sputnik Crisis, not only caused by a looming Cold War, but of the failures of the US education system and a perception of American weakness. Something had to be done, so multiple changes were made to education systems and space programs were accelerated. These were a few of the key factors in how Sputnik broke political, educational, and technological barriers in history. It all began in 1952 when the International Council of Scientific Unions, or ICSU, settled July 1, 1957 to December 31, 1958 as the International Geophysical Year, or IGY, because they knew that it would span the peak of the solar cycle. This would allow for satellites to study a broader array of sciences, and in October of 1954, the Council decided that artificial satellites should be launched during the IGY to accomplish tasks such as map the Earth's surface. In July of 1955, the US government announced its plan to launch a satellite as part of the IGY and began requesting proposals for a satellite design. In September of the same year, the Naval Research Laboratory's proposal for a satellite called Vanguard was selected to be the project representing the US for the IGY. At the time, technology was very limited. The UNIVAC, which stood for Universal Automatic Computer, was invented in 1951, just 6 years before Sputnik was launched, and was the first general-purpose electronic digital computer. It was the size of a room and weighed almost 7.6 tons. The integrated circuit was yet to be invented, and transistors were just beginning to replace vacuum tubes, allowing computers to get smaller. Amid the beginning of the Cold War, the only delivery method of bombs was dropping them from aircraft. Not only was technology very limited, but education standards were also lower. About 100 years ago, elite professors in the US began to think that homework was a misuse of time and was even unhealthy for students. The Californian government even outlawed homework when it made a law stating that children under 15 years of age should not have to do any. Homework never really came back until Sputnik was launched because schools decided that if the US was going to catch up to the USSR, students would have to learn more math and science. The Cold War was proceeding and tensions between the US and the Soviet Union were growing. Both countries were worried by the other country's capabilities, so the Soviet Union wanted to demonstrate their superiority to the US by launching the first satellite into orbit. Sputnik was launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, a missile range in what is currently known as Kazakhstan. The first satellite and later the first dog and human to go to space were both launched from here. Sputnik was launched aboard an R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile, and variants of the R-7 served as the launch vehicle for the latter Sputnik missions. Sputnik orbited Earth with a perigee of 135 miles and cruised at 18,000 miles per hour according to Soviet calculations. Its size was similar to a beach ball measuring approximately 2 feet in diameter. Sputnik consisted of 4 whip antennae which were designed to broadcast radio waves that could not only be heard by scientists, but also amateur radio operators around the world. Since Sputnik's engineers were unsure of how radio waves would propagate the ionosphere, they equipped Sputnik with a radio transmitter capable of broadcasting a signal that alternated between 20 MHz and 40 MHz so it could be easily tracked. However, this was only part of the reason why Sputnik's radio transmitters had to work well. The other reason, which may be more imperative than the previous reason, is that the Soviets wanted the citizens of the US to hear Sputnik as it traveled across the sky, as a reminder that they were behind the USSR technologically. For the same reason, Sputnik was made from a polished aluminum sphere to allow it to reflect sunlight to the ground, making it more visible with the aid of a telescope. The Soviets were primarily showing their capabilities to the US, but the 65-degree inclination of the satellite allowed its flight path to cover nearly the entire inhabited Earth, making for a worldwide demonstration of Soviet superiority in space. This demonstration of Soviet superiority was what broke numerous barriers in the US. The United States had always been first. It took them, the USSR, 4 years to catch up to our atomic bomb and 9 months to catch up to our hydrogen bomb, said George Reedy, an aide to Senator Majority Leader and later President Lyndon B. Johnson. Now we are trying to catch up to their satellite. This shows why the sudden launch of the first artificial satellite came as a surprise to many Americans. Few had expected it, and none imagined how impressive it would be. On the 50th anniversary of Sputnik's launch, astronaut Mike Mullane said, "Sputnik was the 9/11 of the day. America was scared." When I interviewed Jeff Nunn from the Museum of Flight, he said, quote, "The reason Sputnik was so alarming to Americans was because they were in the midst of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and the same technology that the Soviet Union used to launch Sputnik was also the world's first ICBM. We Americans were incredibly concerned that if the Soviet Union could put a satellite into orbit, what was preventing them from putting nuclear weapons into orbit?" That quote proves that Americans were very distressed by the capabilities of the Soviets, especially because of the threats that it posed to the US amid the Cold War. Not only did the Soviets beat the US to space, but they were capable of launching a much heavier satellite than the US. With Sputnik weighing 184 pounds, it was much more impressive than the intended 3.5-pound payload that Project Vanguard would have. On December 6, 1957, the US attempted to launch the Vanguard satellite, but the main engine lost thrust, causing it to fall back to Earth in a colossal explosion. The press dubbed the failure Flopnik or Kaputnik, adding to the worries of Americans whose only source of information was the press. The launch created what is known today as the Sputnik Crisis, a period of fear in the Western nations and perception of Soviet superiority in space. It was the Sputnik Crisis that enabled Sputnik to break these barriers in American politics. Due to delays and the urge to launch a satellite before the US, Sputnik 1 carried nothing but a basic radio transmitter, making it nothing more than a flying radio transmitter. This shows that the US wasn't worried about the Soviets' capabilities in space, but rather the device that launched Sputnik to space. This device was the aforementioned R-7 ICBM. Jeff Nunn explained the reason for this fear when he said, quote, "Both the US and the Soviet Union had nuclear weapon capabilities well before Sputnik was launched, but what's important to understand is that those bombs were delivered by an aircraft." Sputnik's launch hinted at the USSR's capabilities to launch a missile remotely, which the US was not yet capable of doing. As the Cold War reached its pinnacle, both countries wanted to be unmatched, so Americans knew they needed to catch up to the Soviets' technology, thus breaking barriers in American technology. The military intelligence that Eisenhower, US president at the time, had reassured him that the US was ahead of the USSR in science and education, but he couldn't compromise this military intelligence to the worried citizens. Combined with the fact that news outlets flooded the public with the USSR's achievement, he failed to reassure the public or journalists that the US was indeed ahead of the USSR. In an attempt to cover up the serious situation that the US was in, President Eisenhower was forced to pass laws that would convince Americans that corrective measures were being taken. One of these laws was called the National Defense Education Act of 1958, which was signed on September 2, 1958, and was designed to improve federal funding and support for STEM education and convince Americans that the US was catching up to the USSR. These laws focused on improving education and increasing federal funding for education, technology, and space research. The aforementioned factors also led to the founding of NASA on July 29, 1958, which facilitated in the United States winning the space race in July 20, 1969. Thus, as a result of the Sputnik Crisis, barriers to better American education and technology were broken. Sputnik broke political, technological, and educational barriers in American history due to many reasons. These reasons consist of how panic that the US was losing to the USSR during the Cold War inflamed the Sputnik Crisis, or how Sputnik's launch pressured Eisenhower to pass laws to enhance federal funding and support for education and technology. Sputnik instigated the space race, and the founding of NASA was directly initiated by Sputnik's launch. No matter what the reason, Sputnik undoubtedly broke many barriers and influenced many things in the 21st century, such as our satellites, education, GPS systems, cell phones, internet, and military technology. Sputnik pressured the US to improve its space technology and was the necessary driving force that broke American barriers to better education and technology.